Morgan and Nancy had been married for 8 years. Their oldest son was 5, and their youngest twin daughters were barely 2 years old. The second pregnancy came as a surprise to the couple. It was unexpected when the doctor at the ultrasound turned the screen and showed 2 tiny dots, explaining that Morgan and Nancy were now parents of many children. Nancy let out a howl of frustration. She absolutely hated going back to Groundhog Day within the 4 walls. Morgan had reassured her, promising to lend a hand and ensure everything would be manageable. "If we need a nanny, we'll hire one," he said, gently wiping away the tears streaming down his beloved wife's cheeks. Soon Nancy had to go to work. Her friends urged her to go to the seaside before finally settling down to a life of housework and work. The woman decided it was not a bad idea. Nancy spread out dreamily, "I want to go on vacation." Morgan smiled. He had heard those words countless times this month, but fortunately for Nancy, he was just about to plan a seaside vacation for her. He knew how exhausted his beloved was when she was on maternity leave with the twins. Hence, Morgan had been tirelessly toiling day and night, grabbing any opportunity to earn extra money. A few weeks later, during dinner, he handed his wife an envelope brimming with money. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were the words, "To my darling on the sea." Nancy shrieked with joy and threw herself around her husband's neck. "Where are you headed?" Morgan inquired with a smile. Nancy nonchalantly shrugged. "Yes, I'll see if any of my girlfriends can accompany me," she said with an uncomfortable smile. Morgan enjoyed the friends his wife had. Since they had been in touch since high school, he had no reason to distrust any of them, not even Nancy. A month later, he bid farewell to his beloved with tranquil heart, allowing her to embark on the eagerly anticipated vacation while he remained at home, tending to their 3 children. Hosha's wet to joyful Nancy threw herself into the trip. For an instant, she felt as though she was a young free girl once again, rather than a lady tormented by life and 2 consecutive maternities. The initial days passed by quite rapidly. By the 4th day of her vacation, Nancy, tired of drinking, she broke away from her pals and visited a spa with a complex of procedures. The woman plunged into a world of bliss. The final item on her agenda was a massage. Stepping into the room filled with semi-darkness and delightful fragrances, she was confused. Before her stood a charming man. He was smiling broadly, and pumped-up muscles were showing under his thin t-shirt. The sight of the masseur excited Nancy, and he began his work. As if nothing had happened. Throughout the day, she couldn't shake off thoughts of the dark-haired man's strong hands, envisioning herself being embraced by him. Later that evening at the club, she didn't immediately identify him. As she danced, he approached her from behind and put his hands on her waist. Nancy released her hands abruptly and pivoted to deliver a sharp slap to the impudent man. However, upon recognizing him as the masseur, embarrassment washed over her. He introduced himself as Martin. The ensuing morning found her in his bed. Her brain was racing with the awareness of what she had done when she finally woke up. She was queasy. She gazed at the man peacefully asleep beside her. She was overcome with shame. Though leaving Martin without a farewell, she hastily collected her belongings and fled into the street barefoot. Askance, the early morning atmosphere, infused with coolness and the scent of the sea, helped clear her thoughts and afforded her a moment for reflection. Upon reaching her room, Nancy had persuaded herself that nothing dreadful had transpired, just a fleeting resort liaison that her dear husband need never uncover. After all, she reasoned, she was entitled to spend those 2 weeks as she pleased, without a hint of remorse. Nancy introduced her paramour to her friends, who, being single ladies, did not judge her, or so she hoped. Emotion clouded her perception, and she failed to register that Jenna, one of them, hardly spoke to her at all. Jenna empathized with Nancy's husband, and she was angry about the situation. Nancy's conduct was utterly unacceptable to Jenna, and she thought feverishly about how to bring the fact of the affair to Morgan's attention. Having thought of nothing better, the woman began to take pictures of the lovers, deciding on arrival home anonymously send the deceived man pictures, denouncing his unfaithful wife. Nancy was so engrossed in her partner that she failed to realize the time passing very quickly. It was sad to part, bravely declining Martin's request for her email or phone number. She opted to preserve this enchanting romance solely as a cherished memory. Martin gave her a bracelet, a creepy craft from a gift store. Nancy promised to keep the gift at home. Eftma's wife went on as usual. After 2 weeks of not seeing their mother, the children clung to her and were unable to let go. Morgan couldn't take his eyes off his sun-kissed and rejuvenated wife. The vacation had a positive impact on her, almost making it seem like she had shed a few years. During these 2 weeks, Nancy relaxed. Morgan did not suspect anything breaking. On the contrary, his attitude towards her became even more tender. There was no reason for apprehension. The affair with Martin really remained only in her thoughts. It was a while after his wife's trip. Upon arriving at work one day, Morgan received a substantial envelope. From a colleague. The man, clearly astonished, inquired as he twirled the sealed white rectangle in his hands. Who handed it over? The colleague shrugged and explained. A courier delivered it. Some kid. He had your name and surname, insisted on handing it to you personally. But he had no time to open the envelope and look at its contents. Consequently, he tossed it into his car and only recalled it when it was time to head home. What he saw in the envelope shocked him. Within the envelope were roughly 20 photographs, all featuring the same 2 individuals, his wife, Nancy, and an unfamiliar man embracing or kissing her. Morgan clenched his teeth, seething with anger. It was infuriating to think that he had toiled diligently, earned money for his wife's much-anticipated vacation, and she cheats on him. The man struck the steering wheel with intense force, causing the car to emit a distressing shriek. He hurried home. His eldest son was spending the night at his grandmother's. The 2 younger girls were already in bed. Upon arriving home, the distraught husband discovered Nancy seated in a chair, foolishly laughing at a video on his phone. Lunkett entered and tossed the pictures at his wife. Nancy's eyes widened in horror as she examined the images, shifting her gaze from the pictures to her husband. A vein on Morgan's forehead bulged and pulsated with anger. The woman was afraid to argue with him and repented of what she had done. A barrage of insults was directed at her. Morgan had a hard time deciding to leave home. He had been residing at his friend's house for a month, and almost every night he got drunk to the point of insanity. He felt sorry for himself. He felt sorry for the kids. A month later, he came home unshaven and haggard, but with a promise to himself that he would attempt to forgive his wife. For the next 5 years, he convinced himself that he had indeed been able to forgive her. He was able to turn a blind eye to her heinous act, but one day he couldn't bear it and announced to her that he was leaving for good. Deep down, Nancy knew it sooner or later it would happen. Now alone with her children, she started to budget and put in diligent work. Her attempts with men were unsuccessful. They were all hesitant to commit to a woman with 3 children. For a long time, Nancy stayed alone, waking up and falling asleep in a cold bed. Now the next story. Since high school, Judith has harbored dreams of matrimony, a desire instilled in her by her mother. Despite her best efforts, no man managed to remain in her life for more than 6 months. And from this woman felt unhappy and her mother. Judith absorbed her mother's admonitions about the importance of marriage. As a young and impressionable girl, she soaked up these teachings like a sponge. Therefore, when Alan proposed at the age of 20, Judith was overjoyed and ecstatic with happiness. Judith felt that she had reached the pinnacle of her happiness. Alan was a little older, 25 years old. He met his future wife in the park on a bench, where Judith, choking back tears, was trying to wipe off her paint-stained jeans. Their romance was fast-paced and full of love, so when they announced their wedding, no one was surprised. Judith gave birth to 2 children, one after the other, and became a homebody. Alan was ecstatic beyond measure. His spouse went above and beyond. She obeyed her mother's insistence and dutifully performed the duties of a good wife, even though she was exhausted. A delicious hot dinner was always waiting for his beloved at home. The children would go to bed immediately after his arrival, kiss their father on the cheek, and afterward the couple would run to bed to indulge in love. Alan, unabashedly proud, consistently boasted about his significant other to friends and colleagues. In all his conversations, he affectionately referred to his wife as his better half, leaving his male peers genuinely envious. When her son was 5 and her daughter was 3, Judith had a chance to get a job. She graduated from the Faculty of Economics, and after working for 6 months in one of the companies, she successfully went on maternity leave. Following 5 years of an unending stretch of maternity leave, the woman yearned to step back into the outside world. Though she never confessed this desire to anyone, the truth was that Judith had grown weary of family life. She was sick of being a maid in the house, wiping snotty noses and smiling happily at Alan when he came home. She surreptitiously tracked the lives of her pals from high school and university who relished their youth, parties, and socializing with each other. Judith only interacted with other mothers on the playground, and of course, Alan and the children. Secretly from her spouse, she still decided to take a course and go to work afterwards. It was there, at the training center, that she met him. Harold was teaching them accounting. As soon as the lovely man walked into the classroom, Judith fell in love. Harold also observed the attractive Judith, who occupied the first desk and attentively listened to him for a duration of 1.5 hours. He saw the student on the street after class, and they struck up a discussion. It was Friday, and Judith's thoughts of the instructor would not leave her during the weekend. She did not notice how their affair began. The love had overtaken her, so much so that she sometimes forgot about her husband and children. For the first time in married life, she did not prepare dinner for her husband's arrival. Ellen was shocked to see an empty candy dish, the only thing on the table when he got home. And his wife mentioned having a horrible headache. She had, in fact, been speaking with her boyfriend on social media for the whole day. It was the initial call. When the son became unwell 3 weeks later, Judith had to tell her husband that she was going to training. He was surprised, grumbled, but accepted his wife's decision and asked her mother to help with the grandchildren. And while her mother-in-law nursed them, Judith sank into Harold's arms. Alan is alarmed by the wife's altered conduct. In addition to neglecting her marital responsibilities, Judith was unable to make supper, started sleeping in too late, and thus did not have time to wake her husband up for work. The last time Alan had touched his wife in bed, he could not remember. He was silent but furious, resentment bubbling up inside him. For the first time in their life together, Judith and Alan began to quarrel. His mouth pressures. "I forbid you to go to work," he shouted one day in the middle of an argument. "You don't own me," replied the wife. Never before had anything like that been heard in their house. Until this point, the notion of any discord between themselves as a couple had never crossed their minds. Their relationship appeared sickeningly flawless. As the training period drew to a close, Harold and Judith realized that it would be considerably more challenging for them to spend time together. The woman broached the idea of leaving her husband and moving in with Harold on multiple occasions, but the latter displayed no enthusiasm. Judith refrained from bringing it up again, realizing that she couldn't rely on anything, as they were merely lovers. In truth, she knew nothing about her lover. He might even have his own family. Certainly, she had no desire to return to her previous life with a husband she no longer loved. However, going nowhere was not a viable option either. She needed help with her children, and there was no way she could raise them alone. The revelation of her third pregnancy came about inadvertently and, unfortunately, too late. Before going to work, she remembered the medical examination where the gynecologist solemnly congratulated her on the future addition to the family. Overwhelmed by this news, the woman lost consciousness right in the examination chair. Upon regaining awareness and learning about the unfeasibility of an abortion, she sat in the clinic corridor, sobbing for several hours. Everything in the situation frightened her, and what troubled her most was the near certainty that the upcoming baby had no connection to her husband. For the rest of the week, the woman agonized at the thought of having to confess her situation to both of her men. Well, she pondered how best to proceed, and with whom exactly. Jacqueline or Harold. To begin her confession, chance decided everything for her. When Judith returned home from the hospital that day, hastily stashing the ultrasound results, folded her into a drawer along with all the other documents. Ever before had it occurred to Alan to look for something there himself. Typically, he relied on his wife's assistance, but after a recent argument, he was so upset with Judith that he avoided talking to her. Thus, he decided to delve into the fateful drawer himself. The moment he opened it, the first thing that caught his eye were the ultrasound scans. He glanced through the document detailing the pregnancy. He smiled and wondered which child the scans belonged to, daughter or son. And when he saw the date of the study, he was stunned. He approached his wife and passed her the sheet. "What's this?" And tears welled up in Judith's eyes, and fear gripping her like never before. "I'm spiritually sane. I'm pregnant," she whispered. In an instant, Eamon's face lit up with a smile. He gently lifted his wife, embracing her tightly. He showered her with affectionate words, but Judith continued to cry. Suddenly, a sob burst from behind her breast, and she exclaimed, "He's not yours. I don't love you." Breaking free from her husband's embrace, she pressed herself into the couch cushions. The realization of her words gradually dawned on her husband, and when it finally hit him, fury flashed across his face. However, he managed to restrain himself just in time. Judith sobbed uncontrollably, and the man shouted, slamming his fist against the wall, demanding, "Oh, is he?" His wife confessed everything. That very evening, Alan packed his belongings and left the apartment. When she later revealed everything to Harold, he, upon hearing about the predicament of his mistress, pursed his lips and coldly declared that he would not acknowledge the child. "It's Judith. I have a family," he attempted to explain. "I don't want your child. Reconcile with your husband. Figure out a way to raise it together." Judith felt a wave of nausea. This was beyond anything she could have anticipated. Both men had abandoned her, and her worst nightmare was unfolding. But alone, and now with 3 children, the anguish and bitterness within her stirred a primal urge to let out a howl of despair. The idea of such a result was unfathomable, and she resisted embracing her altered reality. Chillen extended assistance to her children to the best of his abilities, yet Judith couldn't rely on much more. Following the divorce, even her mother severed communication, leaving her to single-handedly navigate the challenges of raising her children. She was so exhausted after work that she dropped onto her pillow and sobbed in hopelessness. Her fleeting passion burned out everything alive and native around her, leaving her alone in the ashes of her once happy life. Now the next story. Michael met Jessica at a rather advanced age. Their buddies made fun of his decision, given their age difference of over 14 years. He couldn't resist sharing his sentiments with her because they had managed to maintain their amicable relationship following their divorce. He was uncomfortable that his beloved was being judged in advance, without even having met her in person. She was 28 years old, and the last of her friends who had not married yet. She thus accepted Michael's courting without hesitation when they first met. Her mother only nodded silently while pressing her lips together, clearly disapproving of her decision. The elder woman harbored reservations about the age gap between the lovers, but she did not tell her daughter about it. Jessica threw herself into the relationship. In an attempt to keep Michael near to her, she did her best to be good. He didn't see any imperfections in Jessica since he was so much in love with her. Nor did he notice when, after 3 years of marriage, his spouse found a lover. The affair was not planned by the lady. She happened to meet Stephen. He was holding an event at the restaurant where she was with her pals. Stephen approached Jessica multiple times, showering her with compliments and earnestly requesting her phone number. Jessica found herself pleased by the attention from Stephen. Her pals made a joke about telling her husband everything if she did give him her number. His persistent efforts eventually paid off, and with her pals safely out of sight, she gave him the phone. Stephen left and didn't show up for another week. Having already dismissed the suitor from her thoughts, Jessica was taken aback when the man called and proposed a meeting. "No," she replied firmly to Stephen's request. "Why? It seemed to me that there was a spark between us." "You imagined it," she said politely, and after saying goodbye, she dropped the call. Stephen never gave up on getting in touch with Jessica. He occasionally called and wrote to her in an attempt to gain her favor. Then for the first time, she received a huge bouquet of flowers from him at work. She was astounded that nobody, not even Michael, had taken care of her so exquisitely. The woman changed her anger for mercy and became more favorable to the suitor. Michael observed his wife engaging in frequent phone conversations, occasionally bursting into laughter while reading messages. He inquired once about the person texting her, and she casually mentioned chatting with friends in a general chat room. Blinded by love, Michael failed to recognize that his wife was deceiving him. Initially, Jessica felt embarrassed, often concealing her phone and avoiding communication with Stephen at home. But when she realized that her spouse was not trying to find out anything, she relaxed a little, and then she lost her guard. A series of bouquets began arriving for Jessica at her workplace. Colleagues marveled at what a great relationship she and her husband has. Jessica would smile shyly and blush in response. Little did her colleagues know that the flowers weren't a gift from her husband. It was because of the feeling of embarrassment for the gifts received that the woman agreed to meet with the admirer. Jessica recounted her gathering with friends to her, just with friends to her husband, and later headed out for a date afterward. Although Michael reluctantly allowed her to go, he cherished their Friday night tradition of watching movies together and exchanging thoughts on the week gone by. They used to spend hours upon hours conversing. The man was happy to learn that he had made the proper decision and that he was correct about his sweetheart. After that dinner meeting, Jessica felt as if her head had been blown off with love. She had never felt so strongly. She realized now that she had never loved Michael. Rather, she had married him primarily to fulfill the societal role of being a wife and to seamlessly engage with her friends on an equal footing free from sympathetic glances. Just with Steven in her life, everything seemed to have flipped. Jessica's spouse did not immediately detect these changes in her. The initial warning signs went unnoticed. The man thought that it all seemed to him and that he was imagining non-existent problems. But when he realized that their married life in bed was over, Michael knew it was safe to start panicking. "Darling, there's an issue at your workplace," he asked with concern to his wife. "It's okay," she replied, forcing a smile that failed to reassure Michael. "Maybe you have a grudge against me," he probed, attempting to uncover the truth. Once again, his white smile gently caressed his cheek and insisted that nothing had altered between them, and there was no reason to ask such questions. Reached another lie. That sixth sense of unease gnawed at Michael. It was a disconcerting sensation of deceit that clouded his thoughts. He observed his wife exchanging messages with a man, and Jessica no longer bothered to conceal her phone, casually leaving it wherever she pleased. Knowing that Michael wouldn't think of checking up on her, she had no fear of exposure. Michael didn't have the password to his wife's phone, and he still couldn't figure out who this mysterious Steven was or what he wanted with another man's wife. Choosing not to discuss what he had observed, Michael opted to observe Jessica a bit longer. Jessica was employed at a salon as a manicurist. It was her favorite pastime and a source of cash. Her husband was quite proud of her and her abilities, and she never ran out of clients. Michael decides to involve his ex-wife Susan in the investigation. When he genuinely told her about his suspicions, Susan consented to assist him. She didn't say that she had warned him, that she had predicted it would end this way. Instead, the woman nodded in silence and promised to find out what she could. The ex-wife came to see Jessica at work. Given that Susan had never been a client before, Jessica found it surprising. Jessica couldn't turn her away and promptly began her work. Susan chattered incessantly, discussing herself and posing numerous questions. "You possess beautiful flowers." 3 bouquets, in fact, she grinned. "Michael sent them. If he had done something wrong," she added, winking slyly. Jessica hesitated and responded with a mix of reluctance. "Yes, he did." When Michael received a call from his ex-wife questioning the expensive bouquets he supposedly sent, he didn't know what she was talking about. The woman repeated the question about the flowers and, laughing, clarified where he so sinned. The silence on the other end of the line made it clear to her that Michael had not sent any such bouquets to his wife. Expressing gratitude to Susan for her assistance, he ended the call. By evening, a somber Michael awaited his wife's return from work. In an attempt to lift the mood, he had ordered food from his beloved restaurant, while Jessica had brought home a bottle of wine. As they sat together, time seemed to elongate endlessly. Finally, he realized that his wife's tongue had been loosened. He questioned her outright who this Steven was, whose messages were appearing on her phone, and whose flowers are always in Jessica's office. A scandal broke out, in which the woman first tried to defend her rightness, and then suddenly burst into tears, confessed to her husband that she really cheated on him. "I love him," she whispered, suppressing tears. It was a devastating revelation, hitting him where it hurt the most. In that moment of confession, the man felt the ground shifting beneath him, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Jessica continued to speak incessantly, and he couldn't bear it. "Shut up!" the husband erupted, his shout echoing as he slammed his fist on the table. The wife jumped up and clamped her mouth with the palm of her hand, crying even harder with fear. The evening concluded in a heavy silence, each retreating to separate rooms. Sleep eluded Michael that night. He lost track of the numerous times he stepped outside for a smoke, wrestling with the urge to storm into his wife's room and reignite the argument. The anguish caused by his beloved overwhelmed him. As dawn approached, Michael came to the realization that keeping Jessica close was futile. Their marriage is over. Jessica departed from her husband even before the divorce was finalized. Steven took her in, enveloping her in love and care. The woman felt guilty behind herself for doing such a bad thing to her spouse. She couldn't shake the thought that she should never have agreed to marry Michael, knowing deep down that she didn't love him. Despite several attempts, Jessica found herself unable to communicate with him and offer apologies for everything. Her ex-husband remained unwilling to listen, leading Jessica to the realization that no words from her would alter the situation. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. And if you like it, please support us with a like as well as subscribe to our channel. Stream right in the comments what you think about the story.